Welcome back, we are continuing with Going Native written by Uncle Sealing. Going Native, Chapter 2. Ian awoke to a feeling of warmth and a half-remembered dream of someone holding him tight, skin to skin, his face, hands and feet being vigorously rubbed. As he snapped out of his stupor, Ian found his skin was bare except for an animal fur draped over his waist and he was lying on wooden floorboards next to a roaring fire. At first he didn't want to move, but the sensation of being snug and warm was quickly being outpaced by the realization that he was naked, which meant someone had undressed him, which meant at least one person had been looking at him naked, which meant if his vague recollections were true, one of those sex-crazed human males had actually snuggled up against him, spooning him like they were a woman and he was their mate. His face flushed purple in embarrassment and he pulled the fur blanket up to cover his chest as he sat up and looked at his new surroundings. The room was not large, perhaps 5 meters on a side. The walls were broad wooden beams stacked one on the other and Ian could see 2 doors, one next to the fireplace and another on the wall to his left. There were no windows and not much furniture. He could see a primitive-looking bed against the wall closest to the fireplace and, if the large purple feet and smooth calves sticking off the end were any indication, the soldier they had rescued was naked too. The human was clearly asleep in a chair made from bent strips of wood woven together, curled up under an animal hide blanket with just the top of his head and his cloth-wrapped feet showing. Aside from that there was a small table, a 3-legged stool, an area in the corner with assorted pots and a small built-in shelf that was clearly a food preparation area, and a few homemade wooden boxes, dressers, and chests. There was nothing Ian could think of as modern or even civilized on view. These humans really were savages. After a few moments of searching, Ian's clothing was found hanging on a wooden rack near the fire. They smelled heavily of wood smoke but were dry and warm. Freshly dressed, Ian resumed his pocket-patting ritual he had started near the ship. No compat unfortunately, but considering it was already missing before the group had made their watery getaway he shouldn't be too surprised. There was a moment of panic when he couldn't find his tusk ring and ear cuff, but he soon found them lying on the table near the sleeping human. Ian retrieved the jewelry but the man didn't stir. As quietly as he could manage, Ian crept around to investigate his new surroundings. He checked the door closest to the fireplace and found it lead into a small dark room. Cold wafted forth along with a dry, earthy smell. Some sort of plants, dried and cured meat, and a few other things he couldn't quite identify were hanging from the rafters, and boxes and clay pots lined the walls. He noted that there wasn't any way out from that room and quickly closed it, already regretting opening it as he rubbed his arms and tried to get warm again. Dreading what he might find, Ian approached the other door and gently swung it open. The lead into a small, wide room, a vestibule with another door immediately to the front. The temperature in this room was much colder than he expected and for a moment Ian wanted desperately to go back into the warm room with the backwoods, and possibly Hansi, alien and a woman who would protect him from that alien. Steeling himself, Ian moved forward to the other door, grabbed the wooden latch, and pushed the door open a crack. The blast of icy wind took any thoughts of leaving and threw them as far from Ian's mind as possible. The door was almost ripped from his hand and past the gap he could see nothing but a swirling expanse of white. It was like the world just ended in a featureless and frigid void. Ian wrenched the door closed and backed into the main room, closing that door as well. As he retreated towards the fire, he noticed the duffel bag thrown casually next to the door. The Shilvati duffel bag. Stace was never a particularly light sleeper, but there was one noise that would always instantly throw him into full awake all hands on deck panic mode. His partner had suffered from irregular but severe night terrors, and Stace would regularly pull himself out of even the deepest sleep to come to the rescue whenever the call came. This time, the call came in the form of quiet sobs. It was the sound of someone who is trying desperately not to cry but can't quite manage to hold it in. Stace snapped awake and looked around, trying to find the source, his mind throwing him back a decade or more, before the death and the scandal and the cabin, until he remembered where he was and what had happened in the last 24 hours. The alien Stace had rescued, the male with that soft pale lilac skin, was fully dressed and sitting cross-legged on the floor. The contents of the duffel bag they had rescued were strewn around haphazardly, clothing and papers and such, but there were 2 items that immediately drew Stace's eye. The first was some sort of electronic tablet reminiscent of the smartphones that were becoming increasingly popular before he took his sabbatical. It was sitting right in front of the alien, like a relic he was saying a prayer to. The device was very clearly smashed, the center crushed and the whole screen nearly folded in 2. The second was a pistol. Stace had never seen an alien firearm, but he had known enough of guns in his life to be sure that what was sitting in the small man's lap, held loosely in delicate fingers, was a handgun of some kind. It had the right shape, and form follows function when dealing with instruments of violence. Stace sighed and tried to stand up, but with the shooting pain in his feet it took a few moments for him to be stable. Once he was sure he could move without looking like a fool, he quietly stepped over to the alien and knelt down in front of him. Gingerly, Stace reached down and took the pistol from unresisting fingers and moved it out of reach before grasping the other man about the shoulders and pulling him tight against Stace's bare chest. The alien seemed hesitant at first, impassive to Stace's embrace, but after a few moments the smaller man wrapped his own arms around the human and pulled close. Stace felt an unfamiliar ache near his collarbone before realizing that one of those peculiar tusks was pressing against him. Stace ignored it and let the little alien release all the pent-up anger and fear and impotent frustration that was plaguing him. Once the sobbing subsided and the smaller man seemed to have calmed down, Stace let go and leaned back, finally face to face with the alien he had rescued. The previous day had been a blur of survival and exhaustion, forcing heat into frozen fingers and toes, dragging the unconscious Amazon out of the canoe and into his bed, trying desperately to get everyone dry and warmed up. Now, with a clear head, he could finally take it all in. The alien was small, at least by human standards. 5.5 feet tall by his guess. Stace himself was 6 foot even, but even without the height difference the pale purple body was slight by comparison. Stace noticed the curve of the hips and the flat chest under a very tasteful, if battered, jacket. The alien's face was round, the skin smooth and hairless. The lips were a darker purple, the color of plums and would be considered pouty if not for the small tusks. One had a silver band with a chain going to an ear cuff. That strange jewelry Stace had found in the alien's jacket finally made sense. Add in the disheveled hair, and the look was striking. It was something Stace's partner would have worn and called it his indie rock ensemble, and Stace would have teased him about it and they both would have been laughing. The half-memory hit Stace like a truck, and he found tears in his own eyes as he looked across at the first intelligent being he had seen in a decade. He knew helping these two would be hard, but the pang in his chest told Stace that this was going to be far more difficult than he first thought. Ian found himself blushing furiously as the human looked him up and down. He would be willing to admit that he needed the hug, and even perhaps that he found being wrapped in the larger man's arms soothing in the same way that he would have felt in a female's embrace, but he couldn't help but feel confusion more than anything else. His brain and his body seemed to be reacting to a very different set of signals. The human was much taller than Ian was and far wider at the shoulders. His torso, and why was the crazy human shirtless in this freezer, was muscled but didn't have the striking definition he was used to seeing on females in magazines or on vid. It was the musculature of someone who worked hard every day, not of someone trying to look pretty. Still, there was something so strikingly feminine about seeing a man with that sort of physique. It was disorienting. On top of that, the human's chest and arms seemed to have a light covering of dark hair over the pale skin, matching the hair on his face and head. It was far too thin to be called fur and Ian had a brief flash of memory, an arm with hair like that wrapped around him as he shivered with cold. The hair on the human's face was trimmed short and through it he could see that the human's cheeks were a bright red. Was he blushing? With a start, Ian and the human seemed to realize that they had been looking each other over and they were both flushed with embarrassment. The human turned away and let out a small cough as they continued to sit across from each other, Ian cross-legged and the human on his knees, sitting back on his heels. Ian's embarrassment, and what little calm he had left, was short-lived. Stace was livid and more than a little angry with himself. Here he was having his first contact, possibly humanity's first contact, with an alien race and the two of them were checking each other out like bashful high schoolers at prom. That part of his brain that never shut up was trying to put together a probing joke but that just made him more uncomfortable. Stace turned away from the alien and tried to get his bearings. Seeing the pistol he had placed out of the way, Stace reached over and picked it up. He looked the piece of futuristic tech over, noticing that the purple metal frame was far too large even for his hands. To the smaller male it would be massive, but to the purple giant in the bed it would probably be a fine fit. There wasn't a barrel but instead what looked like some sort of embedded black glass or crystal. Energy weapon of some kind, maybe a laser? Stace was not a physicist. Glancing up slightly, he noticed that the alien was frozen in terror. He looked down at the pistol, then up at the alien again. Looks like any goodwill he might have earned from that hug was gone. Letting out a quiet sigh, Stace flipped the gun around in his hand and offered it to the smaller man. The relief on his face was palpable as he took it and set it down out of the way of both of them. After a moment of silence, Stace pointed at his own chest.
Eustace Grant. Stace.
The alien pointed at his own chest.
Ian Elbrock. Ian.
They both grinned. Stace was in a lot of pain when he stood up. He tried to hide it, but Ian took note as he slipped to his feet and thought about what they had gone through the night before. He was certain that when they were at the ship the human didn't have any sort of limp. Then they went through everything with the boat and the water. Ian was not much of an outdoor boy, but everybody knew the dangers of getting too cold for too long. Stace had pulled him out of the water, then done whatever he needed to get the two Shilvati inside and warmed up. That likely meant getting wet again. It put everything into a different perspective. Not only had the human helped them but he hurt himself doing so, possibly badly.
Do you understand me? Do you speak Shil?
Ian asked, looking at the man. He spoke each word carefully, trying to make sure to hide any trace of accent. The human just looked at him for a moment before spouting gibberish back at him.
I don't have the foggiest idea what you just said. Do you speak any English?
The two stood there staring at each other and, after a moment, the laughter started. The sheer absurdity of the situation hit both men and soon they were hanging off each other, tears streaming from their faces as they let go of their last bit of anxiety. They both knew they were fucked by the situation, but at least they were in it together. After taking a few moments to stuff everything, pistol included, back into the duffel, Ian's eyes caught something he hadn't noticed before. There was another tablet in the room, sitting on the table closest to the chair Stace had been sleeping in. He practically danced over to it before his heart sank. It was a tablet, yes, and a large one, but it was clearly some sort of incredibly stripped-down device. The screen had the texture of paper and it only had a couple tactile buttons on the bottom. He poked it with a finger, but nothing changed. Not even a touch screen. The screen itself was covered in illustrations showing surgical procedures, some sort of medical reference book.
Ian?
He turned at his name and saw Stace standing at the opposite end of the table. Stace pantomimed lifting the table, then pointed next to the bed. With the two of them, moving it wasn't too strenuous and they soon had it positioned. Ian's confusion turned to understanding and then shock as Stace grabbed a white metal case with a red cross that was hanging on the wall and placed it on the table. Opening it up, Stace started removing supplies. Individually wrapped bandages, sterilized packs of suture needles and thread, a scalpel handle, individually packed sterilized blades. A syringe. A few glass bottles and one larger brown plastic one. It was like Ian was looking into the distant past, back to the barbarous days before the Shilvati were even civilized. He shuddered. Stace went over to the fire and removed a steaming metal pot. From there, he used a piece of wood to fish out a couple sets of tiny locking pliers and some small scissors, all bright and shining steel. The water was then poured into a small clay basin. Once it was slightly cooler, the human grabbed a cake of soap and began scrubbing his hands and forearms in the hot water. Ian's eyes widened as he realized what he was about to witness. Once Ian figured out what Stace was about to do, he half expected the lilac alien to try to stop him. This was clearly not a proper operating room and Stace was very clearly not a doctor, but if something wasn't done the much larger alien would die. When he was warming her up the night before he had noticed the piece of shrapnel lodged in her abdomen, jagged and thicker than Stace's thumb. He had wrapped the injury as best he could but if it didn't come out she would either bleed to death or die from infection. He wasn't about to let one of the first aliens he had ever seen, possibly one of the first aliens to end up on Earth, die without him doing everything he could. Stace thought back to the stickers that were on the packages on the ship. The more he thought about it, the more certain he was that he had missed a lot in the last few years. Aliens using a standardized international symbol for explosives meant they probably were interacting with humans and wanted to make sure those humans didn't do something stupid. Not that it changed much. Stace knew from long experience that humans were traditionally stupid. It was practically part of their culture and was one of the main reasons Stace was alone in the first place. It had taken these two crash landing nearby for Stace to realize that he was lonely, perhaps desperately so. After his partner died and the scandal that followed, he had figured he was done with people. A decade living by himself in the Alaskan wilderness had left Stace comfortable and content. And now, with two extraterrestrials in his little cabin that he couldn't communicate with, one of which was dying, he realized that he had let his emotions scar over without actually treating the wounds beneath. Removing the bandages he had wrapped around the large woman proved difficult. They had been glued to her skin by the dried dark blood and as they pulled free the unconscious woman let out a small moan. Finally, the wound was exposed. It was a puncture low on the left side of the alien's abdomen with a twist of purple metal sticking out by a couple centimeters. On a human, it would almost certainly pierce the large intestine and with the sharp upward angle it might even hit a kidney. On an alien? Who knows? His education would probably be helpful here, but dissecting dead and preserved animals for classes was a lot different than surgery on a live alien with quite possibly an incredibly different set of organs, morphology be damned. With his luck he would make the first incision and this huge, heavy alien would pop and go flying around the room like a balloon. Before setting off on his sabbatical, Stace had audited some classes including a few paramedic courses. He wanted to make sure he had enough knowledge of trauma medicine and emergency care that he could keep himself alive and make a trip back to civilization if needed, but he was also aware when he put his trip together that there was a lot he couldn't plan for. If something serious happened out by himself, he would certainly die. He was fine with that. What he was not fine with was letting someone else die in his bed. Luckily for him, and hopefully for her, he packed a lot of reading material. As Stace opened a sterile dressing and poured some iodine on it, he noticed that Ian was washing his own hands and forearms. Maybe they were lucky and Ian was actually some sort of doctor or surgeon, but Stace doubted it. Oh well, it's not like he was one either. He nodded to Ian and got a nod of his own in reply. Time to save a life. Ian didn't know anything about surgery, but he was pretty sure the soldier on the bed was going to die without intervention, and that was enough for him to want to help. He washed his hands in the hot water using the odd-smelling, clearly homemade soap and went to stand next to the human at the bed. Stace was using a piece of cloth coated in a brown liquid to clean the wound and the area around it. He could see a piece of purple metal sticking out of the soldier's abdomen, and Ian felt queasy for a moment before pushing the feeling down. He was not going to get sick. He was going to help. Stace was putting his face close to the wound to look at it, and Ian realized that the man was having trouble seeing in the room's uneven light. The fireplace provided most of the light in the room, and the only other sources were a couple of small candles on the table, also clearly homemade. Glancing into the medical kit, Ian noticed a small mirror tucked in the bottom. Thinking quickly, he grabbed a small bowl, flipped it upside down, and put it on the bed as close to the soldier he could manage. Using the flat bottom as a makeshift stand, he placed a candle on top and used the mirror to help reflect the light onto the wound. Stace pulled his head back and gave Ian a bright smile before going back to cleaning the wound. Ian felt a little tingle inside, glad for the wordless praise. He was helping. Once the wipe down was complete, Stace turned to the table. He glanced over to see that Ian was following his actions, then began pointing.
Gauze.
He said, pointing at the sealed plastic packages.
Scalpel. Forceps. Scissors. Sutures.
Ian nodded along. Lastly, Stace pulled out what looked somewhat like a small plastic pistol in a sealed bag.
Stapler.
Ian said the words to himself in his head again and again, memorizing the names. The little litany in his head was interrupted when he saw what Stace was up to. As Ian watched, Stace began carefully lengthening the wound with a scalpel, freeing up space around the piece of purple shrapnel. He worked slowly, hands shaking slightly as the soldier let out a low groan. When the bleeding began to get worse, he reached out a hand and said,
Forceps.
Ian placed the strange locking pliers in the human's hand and watched as he used them to clamp a blood vessel. Using a wad of bandages, the two of them soaked up the blood, then Stace heated the tip of the scalpel with the candle and touched it to any small vessels that were leaking. With those cauterized, he asked for sutures and sewed up the large blood vessel. Then it was time to go deeper. Ian's face went from pale lilac to almost white once they got through the abdominal wall, seeing the slick dark ropes of intestines and the nearly black purple of organs he could recognize but, in his mild shock, couldn't recall the names of. Stace used his fingers to feel around the piece of metal, then nodded and slowly pulled it free. When Stace held the piece of metal out, Ian took it gingerly and practically threw it onto the table. It was easily longer than his hand, and he was pretty sure that if it had hit him it could have gone clean through. He couldn't stop staring at that twisted piece of shuttle wreckage.
Ian.
With a start, he turned back to see Stace pointing at the mirror. Blushing dark blue, Ian angled the light down into the soldier. Stace seemed to be looking intently for something, fingers gently pushing and prodding inside. Finally he nodded and said,
Sutures.
Once again. It took Ian a moment to see exactly what Stace had been looking for. There was a cut on one of the dark walls of the intestine. Stace stitched it closed with a few tight twists of line and asked for the scissors to cut the remaining thread. He then began closing the soldier up. He worked in layers, sewing as he went until he made it to the skin.
Stapler.
Ian was nauseous and a little dizzy as he handed Stace the stapler. It was the only medical device he saw that he didn't understand at a glance, and when the first put a steel wire into the young woman's skin to hold it closed, Ian finally lost it. He grabbed the water dish and heaved into it as more loud noises followed. Finally the noise stopped and Ian looked over with watery eyes to see Stace filling a syringe. He injected it into the woman's arm, then refilled the syringe from a different bottle and did it again. Finally, The human folded some bandages and covered the jagged, stapled wound. End of chapter. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and visit the author, and I'll see you next time. If you didn't, comment on what I can do better. And as usual, have a wonderful day.